She grew up in a place where people often whispered about humans. They were not cruel in their words, but the way they spoke about them was always filled with caution. The elders told stories of how humans were difficult to understand, quick to argue, and hard to trust. Some described them as too emotional, others as stubborn, and some even called them dangerous. She listened quietly to these stories as a child, and those words stayed with her as she grew older. Even when she had never met a human face to face, her mind was filled with images of what they might be like. The thought of having to live or work with one made her uneasy. She could not imagine opening her heart or her life to someone so different. Her people valued calm voices, steady emotions, and traditions that went back generations. Humans, she had heard, were restless. They wanted to change things quickly, and they did not always stop to think about how their actions could affect others. In her mind, being close to a human meant putting herself at risk of being misunderstood, hurt, or even forgotten. So whenever her family spoke of humans, she tried to stay silent. She avoided joining those conversations not because she had nothing to say, but because her feelings were tangled with fear. Her heart told her it was best to keep a safe distance. It was easier to watch from far away than to step closer and discover the truth. She told herself that she would never need to know a human personally. There were enough people from her own community to walk beside, enough friends to share life with, enough trusted voices to rely on. Why invite fear into her life by meeting someone who might break her trust? But fear has a strange way of shaping choices. It does not only protect, it also limits. She began noticing how often she walked away from places where humans gathered. If she saw one approaching in a market, she would turn to a different path. If she heard that a human was involved in a new project, she found reasons not to join. She never admitted openly that it was fear that drove her steps. But deep down, she knew it. Every choice she made to avoid them was a choice to stay inside the walls her imagination had built. Yet life is rarely a straight road that one can control. She could not stop the world from changing around her. As years passed, more humans began to appear in her city. They came to trade, to work, to share knowledge. Some of her neighbors even formed friendships with them. She watched from a distance, puzzled by how easily others could laugh and talk with the very people she found frightening. Were they not afraid? Did they not know the stories she had heard all her life? There were moments when curiosity pressed against her fear. She would watch as humans sat in the square exchanging gifts or laughing at jokes told in mixed groups. She noticed how animated their expressions were, how quickly their emotions shifted. One moment they could be serious. The next they could burst into laughter. It unsettled her, yet at the same time it drew her attention. Perhaps the stories she had heard were not the whole truth, but she was not ready to test that thought. At night, when she lay awake, her mind often wandered to questions she dared not speak aloud. Were humans really as impatient as she had been told? Did they truly not understand loyalty or calmness? Could they perhaps feel the same fears about her that she felt about them? These questions circled endlessly, but each time they came, she pushed them aside. It was easier to believe the warnings than to step into the unknown. The suggestion of having a human partner, whether in work or in life, felt unthinkable. It was not simply a matter of difference in culture. It was the deep fear of being vulnerable to someone who might not care. Trust in her mind was something fragile. It had to be given carefully, and once broken, it could not be repaired easily. What if a human treated her like a passing interest, someone to walk beside only until something more exciting came along? That thought terrified her more than anything else. Her friends sometimes teased her gently about her fears. They told her she was too cautious, that not all humans were the same. But their words could not break through years of belief. She would smile, nod, and change the subject. Deep inside, she felt safer holding onto her walls. Fear, after all, was familiar. It was easier to hold fear close than to risk the pain of being wrong. Still, life has a way of placing people on paths they never planned to walk. She did not know it then, but the time would come when she could not avoid what she feared. The HFY day would arrive when she would have no choice but to stand face to face with a human, to listen to his words, to see his actions, and to feel his presence. That day was still far away, but even as she tried to hide from it, fate was quietly guiding her steps closer to him. She often told herself she was prepared for anything, but the truth was different. No story, no warning, no whispered fear could truly prepare her for the moment when she would meet the person who would change everything. Life often brings surprises when people least expect them. For her, the surprise came on an ordinary morning. She received a message from her supervisor telling her she would have to work on an important project. At first, she felt pleased. She had always taken pride in her work, and this project seemed like an opportunity to prove herself. But then her eyes caught the last line of the message. Her partner for the project would be a human. Her heart skipped. She read the words again and again, hoping she had misunderstood. But the truth stood clear. She could not refuse. It was an official assignment, and her name was already tied to it. She sat frozen in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. The very thing she had feared for years was now standing right at her door. There was no way around it. She would have to face a human directly, not from a distance, not in passing, but in close work where mistakes could not be hidden. The first meeting came sooner than she was ready for. She walked into the office room with her notes clutched tightly against her chest. Her steps felt heavy, as though her own fear was pulling her down. When she saw him for the first time, she almost turned back. He was taller than she expected, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. His presence filled the room, and she felt small in comparison. She lowered her gaze, unable to look at him for long. He stood and offered a hand in greeting, but she hesitated. She had never been comfortable with such gestures. After a pause, she gave a quick nod instead. For a moment, silence stretched between them. She feared he would be offended, but instead, he simply smiled and took his seat again. That smile unsettled her. It was calm, unhurried, almost gentle. It was not what she had expected. During the first hour, she spoke very little. Whenever he asked her opinion, she answered in short sentences. She avoided meeting his eyes, afraid of what she might see there. But he did not press her. He listened carefully, even to her brief replies, and never rushed her to say more than she wanted. He seemed to sense her unease, though he never pointed it out. That first day passed slowly, filled with her inner struggle. Every sound he made, every movement of his hands, every shift in his tone, she studied with suspicion. She expected impatience, arrogance, or even anger. But none came. Instead, he asked questions politely, explained things clearly, and made sure she understood every detail of the project. She left the room confused. The human she had just met was nothing like the image she had carried in her head all these years. The second meeting was different. She walked in with her guard still high, but this time, she noticed small details she had missed before. He always greeted her first, even if she barely responded. He never interrupted when she spoke, even when she stumbled over her words. And when she made a mistake in her notes, instead of criticizing, he gently pointed it out and showed her the correct way without making her feel foolish. These small actions made her pause. She had expected sharpness, but what she found instead was patience. She had imagined coldness, yet she saw warmth in the way he treated her. Still, she could not let go of her fear so quickly. Her heart warned her not to trust too soon. After all, people could hide their true selves behind masks. Maybe he was only pretending to be kind. Maybe the stories she had heard would still prove true. But day by day, the evidence of her own eyes began to clash with the warnings of her past. She noticed how he respected her time, never demanding more than what was agreed upon. She saw how he listened not only to her words, but to her silence. When she did not want to speak, he let the quiet remain, never pressing, never forcing. And in those quiet moments, she felt something unexpected: comfort. Once, while reviewing a complex part of the project, she made a suggestion that she was sure was not very good. She braced herself for criticism. But instead, he leaned forward, considered her words carefully, and said, That's actually a strong idea. We can build on it. His response left her speechless. For the first time, she felt that her voice mattered, even to someone she had once believed would never respect her. It was not only his words but also his actions that left an impression. When they shared tasks, he never left her with the heavier share. If anything, he took on the harder parts himself. Once, when she looked tired, he noticed before she even said a word. Without making a show of it, he adjusted the plan so she could rest a little more. He never announced his kindness or tried to gain credit. It was simply in the way he worked beside her. Slowly, she found herself lowering her guard. She still kept a cautious distance, but she no longer trembled when entering the room. She no longer rushed her words or avoided every glance. She even began to watch him more closely, not with fear but with curiosity. His expressions fascinated her, so open, so honest. When he was serious, his brow furrowed deeply. When he was amused, laughter lit up his face in a way that was impossible to fake. She realized that humans wore their hearts openly, and perhaps that was not such a terrible thing. One afternoon, as they finished their work, she caught herself smiling at something he said. The realization startled her. She quickly looked away, embarrassed. But in that moment, she understood something was beginning to change. The human who had once been only a shadow in her fears was now a real person, sitting across from her, speaking with kindness, showing patience, and proving with every small gesture that the stories she had believed were not the whole truth. She did not yet trust him fully, not yet. But for the first time in her life, she felt the possibility of trust. And though she would not admit it to herself, she began to wonder what it might mean to know him not as the human partner, but simply as the man who was slowly breaking down her walls. The days turned into weeks, and the project that had once filled her with dread slowly became a part of her daily life. At first, she told herself she was only enduring it because she had no choice, but something in her heart began to shift. It was not a sudden change, but a slow and steady one, built through small moments she had never expected. She remembered one of the first times she truly saw a different side of him. She was struggling with a technical problem in their work, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to correct the mistake. In the past, whenever she had made errors in front of others, they would sigh in frustration or remind her of how important it was to be careful. She braced herself for the same reaction from him. But instead, he leaned closer and said in a calm voice, "It's all right. Everyone makes mistakes. Let's look at it together." He took the papers from her hand gently, not snatching, not rushing. His tone carried no judgment, only patience. That small gesture left her stunned. For hours afterward, she replayed his words in her mind. The following week, another moment stood out to her. She had been late in submitting her notes, something that normally would earn sharp criticism. She sat nervously, expecting his disappointment. But when she apologized, he simply smiled and said, "Don't worry. What matters is that we finish it well." His ability to look past small flaws and focus on the bigger picture unsettled her, but also softened something deep inside her heart. It was as though he valued her effort more than her mistakes. And that was a kindness she had not expected from anyone, least of all from a human. Her fear began to melt, not through grand actions but through these simple gestures of understanding. It was not that he was flawless. He made his own errors too. But when he did, he never tried to hide them or blame someone else. He admitted them openly and laughed about them, as if mistakes were not signs of weakness but simple steps in learning. She had never seen anyone treat failure with such ease, and watching him made her wonder if perhaps she had been too harsh on herself all these years. Over time, she found herself noticing how carefully he listened. When she spoke about her culture or her traditions, she expected him to grow impatient. She thought he would dismiss her words as unimportant, but he surprised her again. He asked questions not in a mocking way, but with genuine curiosity. When she described something sacred from her people's history, he leaned forward, his eyes showing real interest. It was strange to her because she had been taught that humans cared only about their own ways. Yet here was one who not only listened, but also respected her voice. One afternoon, she saw something that touched her deeply. They were in a crowded office, surrounded by others. She made a suggestion for their work, but her voice was quiet, almost lost in the noise. Another colleague tried to speak over her, but before she could shrink into silence, he interrupted gently. "Wait," he said, looking directly at her. "I think she was saying something important. Could you repeat it?" She felt her cheeks warm with surprise. No one had ever stopped a room just to hear her words. And when she repeated her idea, he nodded and said, "That's worth trying." That moment stayed with her, a seed planted deep in her heart. It was not only in professional matters that he showed his character. She began to notice little things, like how he never raised his voice even when situations became tense, or how he would step aside to let others pass through a doorway first. Once, when she was carrying a heavy stack of papers, he quietly took half from her arms without asking, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He did not act as though he was doing her a favor. He simply acted as though helping was part of who he was. These small things added up. The walls she had built inside herself, brick by brick over years of fear and warnings, began to weaken. She found herself lowering her guard without even realizing it. There were times she caught herself laughing at his jokes, something she had promised she would never do. His humor was simple, not mocking or sharp, but lighthearted in a way that eased the stress of long hours. The sound of her own laughter in his presence startled her, but it also made her realize how far she had come from the days when she could barely look at him. What surprised her most was how consistent he was. She had expected his kindness to fade once he grew comfortable, but it did not. Day after day, he remained steady, the same patience, the same gentleness, the same respect. Slowly, she began to trust that his actions were not an act, not a mask, but a reflection of who he truly was. Still, she did not give her trust easily. There were moments when her old fears tried to return. Sometimes she wondered if perhaps he would one day show the side she had always been warned about: impatience, cruelty, or arrogance. But each time those doubts rose, his actions answered them without words. When she struggled, he encouraged. When she was silent, he gave her space. When she succeeded, he celebrated quietly, without envy. Each choice he made showed her a truth that was hard to deny. He was not the monster her mind had imagined. She began to feel something new, something fragile but undeniable. It was a sense of safety. She had never believed she could feel safe around a human, yet here she was, sitting across from one every day, and instead of fear, she felt calm. Instead of tension, she felt a strange warmth that made her look forward to their meetings. One evening, as she walked home after another long day, she found herself smiling without realizing it. She thought of his words, his gestures, the way he made her feel less small, less afraid. She stopped in her steps, the realization hitting her with quiet force. The human who had once represented her greatest fear was now the person teaching her what trust truly meant. And though she was not ready to admit it openly, a part of her heart had already begun to change. What once frightened her was slowly becoming the very thing she looked forward to. The project that had once been a burden was now almost complete. The long hours, the endless details, and the constant adjustments had tested them both. Yet what stood out most to her was not the work itself, but the way he handled every difficulty that came their way. She remembered a week that had been especially hard. Deadlines had tightened, mistakes were piling up, and she felt the pressure pressing down like a weight on her shoulders. She tried to hide it at first, pushing herself to work faster, staying up late to correct small errors, and refusing to admit how tired she was. But exhaustion has a way of showing itself even when one tries to hide it. He noticed. She could tell by the way his eyes softened whenever he looked at her, by the way he quietly shifted tasks to make her load lighter. He didn't call attention to her struggle, and that was what surprised her most. Instead of pointing out her weakness, he quietly strengthened her without saying much at all. One afternoon, when her hands shook from fatigue, he placed a cup of water in front of her. "You should take a break," he said simply. She shook, her head embarrassed. "We don't have time." But he answered calmly, "We will manage the time. You can't keep working like this. His voice was not commanding, not sharp. It carried only concern. For a long moment she stared at him, wondering why he cared. She had always believed humans were selfish, thinking only of themselves. Yet here was one who was choosing her well-being over speed, who was willing to slow down just to make sure she was all right. The turning point came late one evening when the project reached a breaking point. She had stayed far longer than she should have, her eyes heavy, her thoughts scattered. A mistake slipped through her hands, and when she realized it, she felt a rush of panic. She expected anger from him, or at least disappointment. She braced herself, ready to hear harsh words, but instead he only sighed softly and said, "Don't worry. We'll fix it together." That was all. No judgment, no scolding, no raising of his voice. He simply accepted the mistake as part of the work and moved on. That moment struck her like lightning. All her fears, all her years of believing that humans were harsh, seemed to crumble in the face of his calm kindness. She realized how much she had been wrong, not because the stories she had heard were lies, but because they were only half-truths. People could be unpredictable, yes, but they could also be steady. They could be emotional, yes, but emotions could also be gentle. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit the truth. She trusted him, not just a little, not only in small ways, but fully. She trusted that he would not harm her, that he would not mock her, that he would not abandon her when things grew difficult. She trusted that his words were honest and his actions sincere. That trust changed everything. It changed the way she spoke to him, the way she listened, and even the way she looked at him. She no longer avoided his eyes. She found herself meeting his gaze, holding it, and sometimes even smiling without meaning to. The warmth she once feared now felt like sunlight breaking through after a long storm. And in that warmth, she discovered something else, something deeper. She realized that her fear had not only been about humans, it had been about herself. She had been afraid of being vulnerable, of being seen as weak, of placing her heart in someone else's hands. But he had shown her that trust was not weakness, it was strength. And sometimes, trusting the right person could bring peace greater than anything she had known before. That evening, as they finished another long day, she walked home in silence, her mind full of him. She realized she was no longer afraid. The prospect of a human partner no longer frightened her, because now she knew him, and knowing him was enough to change everything she had once believed. When the project finally ended, she expected relief. She thought she would be glad to return to her normal life, free from the daily meetings, the constant collaboration, and the steady presence of the human she had once feared. But when the final day came, she felt something different, something unexpected. Instead of relief, she felt emptiness. She had grown used to seeing him each morning, to hearing his voice, to working beside him. The thought of that suddenly ending left her unsettled. On the last day, as they packed away their papers and exchanged a few words about their success, she found herself quiet. She wanted to say more, to thank him, to tell him how much his kindness had changed her, but the words stayed locked in her chest. She only managed a small smile, hoping he could see the truth behind it. To her surprise, he noticed. "You seem quiet," he said gently. She hesitated, then answered, "I was just thinking, I learned a lot during this project." He tilted his head, waiting, as though he knew there was more. She added softly, "Not just about the work, about people too." He didn't push her to explain further. Instead, he gave a small smile, one that reached his eyes, and simply said, "I'm glad." That moment stayed with her long after they parted ways. In the days that followed, she found herself missing him. She missed the way he listened, the way he noticed small details, the way he made her feel safe. She had never expected this feeling. The human she had once dreaded had become someone whose absence left a space in her daily life. She wondered if he thought of her too, if he remembered the small moments they had shared. Then one afternoon, when she least expected it, she saw him again. He was standing in the marketplace, speaking with a group of people. For a moment, she froze. Her old instinct was to turn away, to hide, but her heart pushed her forward instead. Before she realized it, her steps had carried her closer. When he noticed her, his face lit up with recognition. "It's good to see you," he said warmly. Something about those words touched her deeply. She realized then that he had not been just a partner in work. He had become part of her story. They began to talk, not about projects or deadlines, but about life. Their conversation flowed easily, as though the walls between them had vanished completely. As the sun lowered that day, she felt a calm certainty inside her. She no longer saw him as the human, but simply as himself. He was not the frightening figure from her childhood stories. He was not the stranger she had once avoided. He was the man who had taught her patience, kindness, and trust. And in that moment, she knew something she had never believed possible. The prospect of a human partner had once filled her with fear, but now it was the very thought that filled her with hope. Meeting him had changed not only how she saw humans, it had changed how she saw herself. She had discovered courage she never knew she had, and in that courage she had found someone who mattered. As she walked home that evening, she carried no fear, no hesitation. Instead, she carried the memory of his smile, the warmth of his words, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the people we fear most are the ones who can show us the true meaning of trust.